So let me see. Okay, got it.
Steve, did you get my email about that light?
I did.
No, that's
Oh.
fine.
Yeah, I'll order that. I sent a couple email or one email to All and Jane about something they can get for her music stand and the piano. And as soon as I hear back from them, I'll order them and they'll be ready for the 13th.
Okay.
Yeah, because that's the next time we're going to be at the UU, I think, November
Yeah.
13th.
It is.
Is
Yeah.
that the
Rabbi,
same?
Rabbi, do you want to just do your presentation and wait for questions at the end? How do you want to handle it? Okay.
Yeah, let's do that.
I'll put you on speaker view and then you'll be on, and then at the end we'll go to gallery view and people can, if they have questions or comments, they can do it
Sure.
at that point. Okay.
Sure. Yep. That'd be great. Now, this is on YouTube Live also, right?
It just went on. Yep.
Okay.
And Rabbi, I'm going to be meeting a guy named John Forsyth on Friday about the sound. So here's what he told me. You're going to have that same battery pack that you had at High Holy Days.
Okay.
And then Jane will have a handheld mic and a stand.
Okay.
And he's going to show me what I have to turn on in the sanctuary closet so that it comes out to the pavilion,
Okay.
and then it'll come out through the speakers on the pavilion.
Oh, great. Okay.
So
That
we
works.
should be good to go.
Because, I mean, I got the sense there were some people who couldn't hear.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the
No
ones
matter
way in
how
the back.
loud I
Yeah,
spoke,
yeah.
there were still people.
Yeah. The ones who decide to sit as far away as they could.
Right.
But I mean, really, and that's expecting a lot of you and Jane to really shout when we can mic you and make it a lot easier.
Yeah.
Okay.
So.
I was in the back and I heard every word.
You
Yeah,
did?
it was fine where we were. Just people that are way far, the furthest from the doorway there that may have had a problem, but I don't know why
Well,
they had to go
Patty,
back. Yeah.
And
you're
you-
younger and your hearing's better.
Right.
I have such bad hearing that, I always sit up front, as you know, because of my hearing. Um,
Okay, somebody's calling in.
Hello, everybody.
Hi,
Hi.
Hi, Shelley.
how are you?
Hello.
Good.
Hi,
How are
everybody.
you?
Hi, Gusty. I hear
Hi,
you, but I
Gusty.
don't see you.
Oh, let's see.
There
Yeah,
you
she's there.
are.
She's there.
Hi.
Turn this off. Okay.
So it looks like we should be able to start doing the Friday night services on the 19th.
Yes,
Sounds wonderful.
it does. And once I meet with Forsyth on Friday, I'll send you an email, Charles, and just confirm that we'll be good to go.
Okay, sounds good.
I
Does
think.
that mean good to
I
go
think-
on the patio?
Yeah,
Yeah.
we're gonna, Charles will tell you.
Oh,
Will we be
okay.
able to, Steve, make sure there's going to be enough electrical outlets for the arc and the memorial boards and everything too? So,
Yeah, my question about the memorial board, I understand it would be nice to get it out there, but do you think we can get it out there safely?
they should be
Yeah.
able to. They should
Well,
be
I
able
don't see
to.
why, if you get the arc out there, I don't see why you shouldn't. be
Yeah,
able
they
to-
can, well, the memorial board's a little harder to move, but they should be able to get it out there if they're careful. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's fine. I'll have them put it out there then.
But we need another outlet for that.
Just need a power strip, Joe.
A power strip would help. Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, power strip is all you really need. A
Yeah.
good heavy duty power strip, yeah.
Well, when I order the lights, I'll order a power strip. too.
I've got a power strip.
Okay,
I got 2 or 3 that I'm not using. You're
okay,
welcome to use, yeah.
okay. That's good.
I thought the outdoor service was wonderful. It was so good to see everybody.
Yeah.
I
Yes.
agree. I
think-
felt Yeah.
I think the only night we will not be able to do services there will be on the 24th of December. That service will
Yeah,
have,
they have
that
Christmas Eve
service will
service.
have to be a Zoom service
Yep.
Yeah.
because
Right.
they're using the church for Christmas Eve services.
Right.
Yeah.
And,
So we'll be doing a Zoom service that night.
and we don't have services the week of Thanksgiving, correct?
Right,
No,
right.
nope. No. Okay.
Are
Should
you ready?
we,
Let me put you on speaker view, Rabbi, and then we'll get going. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, great. Welcome, everybody. I'm glad to see so many people who are participating in our our very first adult education of the year. I chose this topic, and I chose the topic first for a couple of reasons. One is because we're living through a pandemic. I just thought it would be interesting to look at number one. Well, there's actually three things I want to cover tonight. One is the Jewish response to pandemics. The second is how the ancient Israelites dealt with epidemics. And I want to talk about the Bible in terms of prophecy and ritual, in terms of illness, sickness, plague, and epidemics. So those are the three things that I'd like to cover. I want to start off with a quote, which comes from the book of Jeremiah, which says, "Death has come up into our windows. It has entered our palaces to cut off the children from the streets and the young men from the squares." That's from Jeremiah chapter 9. Catastrophes have always touched people's lives. And it's with those words that the prophet Jeremiah addressed a disaster of his time, centuries before the common era. Now, if you read the papers or listen to the news nowadays in real time, in modernity, you'll find that scientists are working to explain the causes and the origins of the coronavirus with evidence supporting their explanations. And yet, with all of the scientists working to explain the causes and the origins of the coronavirus with all of their evidence, still conspiracy theories abound. And one of the things I'd like you to keep in the back of your mind is that some religious leaders have suggested that the virus is God's message for people. And whether the conspiracy theory is attributed to some sort of political maneuvering, or if the conspiracy theory is attributed to divine intervention, these theories propose that science does not explain disasters sufficiently for many people. Throughout history, and if you look at history, people have believed that disasters carry otherworldly messages. Often these messages propose that people have some kind of responsibility for their present suffering. Now, that kind of belief may encourage one to understand the causes of catastrophes so that they can be avoided in the future. But it also suggests that disasters, like a pandemic, can teach people something about how life should be lived. The Bible, when I talk about the Bible tonight, I'm specifically referring to the Old Testament. The Bible has lots of different stories of God-sent illnesses, which typically communicate some sort of punishment for wrongdoings. Understanding these messages required interpretation. They didn't look for doctors. In fact, doctors are found very, very rarely in the Old Testament. What they ask for or what they look for in the Bible is some sort of specific ritual treatment. These methods allowed people to prepare themselves for the possible calamities that were going to take place in the future. Understanding human needs to find explanations for the unknown may help us to understand that many of the non-scientific explanations that people continue to give for the pandemic come from a need to find some sort of an answer, a need to find some sort of an explanation that makes sense to them. Now, in lots of different cultures, different gods are responsible for different areas of life. In the stories of the Old Testament, we have one God who is usually accountable for all of the different spheres of life. Hence, it's this God who has a role not only in both bringing illness, but also in curing it. There's one narrative that we find in the Old Testament where God sends plagues during the Passover holiday or during the Passover celebration. You know the story, God sends 10 plagues before the Jewish people were liberated from slavery in Egypt. One of the plagues of boils is both something that affect human and animal bodies. I'm not sure whether many people realize that. It wasn't just on human beings. If you look at Exodus chapter 9, verse 9, but despite the disaster, Pharaoh, of course, does not let the Jewish people leave. And according to the story, Pharaoh himself is not affected or infected by the boils, so that he's able to witness God's control. In Exodus 9, it says, I have let you live to show you my power. And in this story, boils, as are all of the plagues, are a sign of God's power. Now, as I mentioned a few moments ago, the Old Testament seldom ever mentions doctors, but there are various religious experts, including prophets and priests, that provide responses to the illnesses that are incurred in the Bible. Prophets were considered instrumental in conveying godly messages to people. In a situation of crisis, they explain to the people why God was so upset. For instance, for example, the prophet Jeremiah warns King Zedekiah that all the inhabitants of Jerusalem are going to die by the sword, famine, and pestilence due to Israel's transgressions. There's an explanation as to exactly what was going to happen, but not just what was going to happen, why it was going to happen. And whereas prophets delivered godly messages and helped uncover the reason for the illness, it was priests who communicated with God through rituals. If the cause of illness was God's anger, then only God could provide some sort of recovery from it. Therefore, one had to be able to find a way to appease that anger. Priests were able to do this by carrying out the right rituals. For example, the priests advised the Philistines to return the covenantal ark together with a guilt offering in the first book of Samuel. A guilt offering was a sacrifice that the priests carried out, especially in a situation of an unintentional offense on behalf of the transgressor. It was not the person who committed the offense who did the ritual. It was the priest for that person. The transgressor had to provide the priest an unblemished ram for the sacrifice. They had to provide monetary compensation for the victim for the loss, and they had to pay some sort of payment for the priest. And it was biblical legislation that determined the guilt offering would settle the offense in front of God. Now, in the Old Testament, it was often more important to address the cause of the disease through a ritual than finding some sort of a medical cure to it. Now, that's important because they weren't concerned with the reasons. They weren't concerned with the outcome. They were concerned with the ritual that was going to obliterate whatever was taking place to harm people. A person may not have control over their fate, but rituals offered some sense of security to biblical people in the midst of catastrophes. Now, if you think about it, during COVID-19, many religious people have turned to their religious responses. Others have engaged with actions that create connections and care. They do not directly address the pandemic, but nonetheless, they find a way to develop for themselves some kind of emotional relief or emotional support. People have always searched for meaning in their misfortunes in difficult circumstances or in difficult times. It can be comforting to believe that things happen for a reason and that something can be learned in chaotic situations. But different explanations allow people to create their own responses to cope with the unknown. And recognizing this human need to rationalize crisis helps us to understand a variety of explanations that people continue to give for the pandemic that we're suffering through right now. Now, going back to the Old Testament, there's a verse in the book of Exodus that says, if you will diligently hearken to the voice of the Lord thy God, and will do that which is right in his sight, and will give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of these diseases upon thee, which I have brought upon the Egyptians, for I am the Lord that healeth thee. That's from Exodus chapter 15. Throughout much of history, the Jewish response to plagues and to pandemics and to illness was to plead for God's mercy and God's forgiveness. That was the response of the community. We're told in the book of Numbers, when an epidemic killed Israelites following Korach's rebellion against Moses and Aaron, the dying stopped only once Aaron burned incense to assuage God's wrath. Later, if you look at King David's reign, when an epidemic ravaged the kingdom of Israel, only a prescribed sacrifice offered by the king was given to be able to avert any further loss of life. The destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem in 70 CE by the Romans did not weaken the conviction that their God, one true God, controlled epidemics. But it did change the way that Jews appealed to God when disease struck. No more could they assuage God's anger with animal sacrifice and the sweet savor of incense. So, new procedures had to be developed. And if you look beyond the Bible, if you go to books like the Mishnah or other rabbinical writings, when an epidemic struck a community, its Jewish residents would assemble for communal prayer and communal fasting. Now, several years before the catastrophic influenza pandemic struck the world in 1918, there were calamitous plagues that were killing millions in the Middle East. After 1914, the region of the Middle East suffered from malaria and typhus, cholera, dysentery, smallpox, and venereal disease. There was a disastrous locust plague that struck Israel. It stripped the land completely of its crops. What food the civilians there had hoarded would then be looted by Turkish soldiers. Tens of thousands of civilian residents would ultimately perish from hunger and illness. During the World War I campaign in the Middle East, more soldiers die from epidemic diseases than from bullets. Louse-borne typhus, cholera, contaminated water, malarial mosquitoes were often mostly the lethal agents. 1/3 of Jerusalem's population died from the epidemic that struck well before the 1918 influenza pandemic. Hundreds of Jews from Jerusalem, Hebron, and Gaza, who were affiliated with the Turkish military base in Beersheba, when they returned to their homes, the plague spread like wildfire. The Ottoman army was abysmally prepared for the disease and the public health challenges that it was unleashing. Widespread epidemics consumed Ottoman soldiers and civilians during World War I. Typhus, malaria, relapsing fever, transmitted disease, infected lice, mosquitoes, and ticks. Those were some of the deadliest assailants, followed by bacterial disease like dysentery and typhoid. The Ottoman Empire's poor infrastructure contributed to the spread of disease. Limited trains to and from the fronts were often packed to capacity, meaning that common soldiers and microbes were crammed into unsanitary conditions, into freight cars over long stretches of time. And the fact that soldiers often had to march to and from the front made it difficult for the Ottoman sanitary officials to maintain any kind of adequate hygiene. And it was during these marches that soldiers would at random mingle with civilians, picking up or leaving germs and microbes. Now, a century ago, there was an interesting Jewish response to a life-threatening epidemic. I doubt that any of you have heard about this. If I'm wrong, please let me know later. It's doubtful that any of you have heard about this Jewish response to life-threatening epidemics. It was called the Schwarze Chasana. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that. Schwarze Chasana means the Black Wedding, which took place in response to the awful waves of cholera and typhus and influenza that ravaged the Jews of Eastern Europe, Israel, and North America. And although its origins are completely unknown, the Schwarze Chasana, the Black Wedding, has been imported from Eastern Europe, where it's been practiced since the 18th century. The earliest recorded Black Wedding was performed in 1785 in the presence of one of the great founders of the Hasidic movement, Rabbi Elimelech of Lizhensk. It took place in response to the outbreak of cholera. In 1865, Black weddings took place in Sfat and Jerusalem following another natural disaster, a massive plague of locusts that destroyed crops and resulted in lots of deaths. The wedding took place on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem, was attended by many. It was described as a really joyous occasion. An eyewitness reported that the leaders of the holy city took boys and girls who were orphans and married them off to each other. The chuppot, the canopies, were set up in a cemetery between the graves of two mystical masters, the Ari, Rabbi Isaac Luria Ashkenazi, and the Beit Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo. For this was the tradition that they had. The ceremony was also performed in Canada on November 11th, 1918, under the headline, Hebrews Hold Wedding of Death to Halt Flu. A local newspaper reported on this elaborate wedding that had been planned for more than a month. At the end of one of the cemeteries, a quorum of 10 Jews conducted a funeral. At the other end, 1,000 Gentiles and Jews witnessed a wedding. Harry Fleckman and Dora Weissman were contracting parties at the wedding. The ceremony was simple. A man and a woman, each unmarried and either impoverished, orphaned, or disabled, sometimes all three, were married together as husband and wife underneath the chuppah in a cemetery. The couple's new home was established by donations by the community. And with this act of what we call group chesed, you all know what chesed, group chesed, group righteousness. It was hoped that the plague would be averted. For example, as the Jews of Philadelphia gathered in the cemetery with the goal of defeating the deadly influenza outbreak, by the time it was finally over, The Great Flu Pandemic of 1918 to 1919 claimed 50 to 100 million lives worldwide. In the United States, over 670,000 people died. And according to newspaper reports, community leaders in Philadelphia selected Fanny Jacobs and Harold Rosenberg as their Schwarze Chasana, as their bride and groom. The two were married at the first line of graves in the Jewish cemetery. More than 1,000 people watched as the rabbi officiated at the chuppah. And when, amid their stark surroundings, the couple were pronounced husband and wife, the Orthodox among the spectators filed solemnly past the couple, made them presents of money in sums anywhere from 10 cents to $100, according to their means and circumstances, until more than $1,000 had been given. The Jewish community had chosen this intervention so that the attention of God would be called to the affliction of their fellows if the most humble man and woman among them should join in marriage in the presence of the dead. Now, in 1918, viruses had yet to be discovered. A century ago, there were theories about what caused influenza, whose very name points to the presumed etiology, comes from the Italian word meaning influence, because it was believed that the disease was caused by an inauspicious alignment of the planets. As we also know, throughout much of history, Jews were also blamed for such plagues. At the time of the Black Death in the 14th century, many Jewish communities were destroyed as mobs held the Jews for being responsible. There were other early beliefs as well. The famous 17th century English physician, Thomas Sneidham, believed these epidemics were related to heavy rain that filled the blood with crude and watery particles. Some physicians resorted to bloodletting, the practice of draining the body of blood, and therefore, in theory, the toxins of disease. It had been a mainstream medical practice for more than 2,000 years. The procedure is frequently described in the Talmud, which mandated a blessing to be made before it was undertaken. In 1918, British doctors had performed bloodletting on ailing servicemen. They claimed it had worked and published their experience in the British Medical Journal. We look back on these kinds of episodes in horror, but at the time, it was cutting-edge science. As one physician noted, let them wear a rabbit's foot on a gold watch chain if they want to, and if it will help them get rid of the psychological action of fear. I want to talk about one other thing that we find biblically. It may feel, as we go through the COVID-19 pandemic, it may feel like this current crisis is completely unprecedented. But the truth is that we can look back to history for evidence of what has happened before and how people had survived pandemics. Jewish and biblical history hold valuable insights into our present situation. When King David conducted a census of the population, he ordered the counting of the people directly, which is something that's never done in Judaism. We never count people directly. Instead of counting indirectly by means of the half shekel, which is the way it's described in the Torah. As a result, the rabbis tell us, a plague took place which killed 70,000 people, with 100 people dying every day. it was decreed that the plague would be annulled if 100 brachot, 100 blessings, were recited each day. The rabbis explained that since 100 people died every day from the plague, the recitation of 100 blessings each day would counteract or be measure for measure. In another instance, we find the terror of plagues in Leviticus 26. And I will bring the sword upon you. And when you gather together in your cities, I will send pestilence upon you. And yet another example in Ezekiel, the sword is without the pestilence and the famine within. And beyond that, the Philistines capture the ark, was said to cause a plague of hemorrhoids, according to the Torah. What remedies have rabbis suggested over the ages to defend against these epidemics? Well, the Talmud mentions the efficacy of offering prayers, particularly Tehillim, Psalms. If the situation does not allow large gatherings, then synchronized prayer done at the same time in private domain might be just as effective. This is also the theory behind something called Daf Yomi, which is studying a page of Talmud a day, which is the central text of Jewish law. Being in quarantine or in self-isolation at the time may give you more time to study. So you might like to keep in mind the elixir of old given the rabbis for remedying not just physical illnesses, but also spiritual illnesses. One of the sages, known as the Chofetz Chaim, urges the study of law regarding slander and gossip that are believed also to curb the onset of plague and warns against causing harm psychologically of persons by mean speak, embarrassing people in public, and otherwise causing harm to individuals. You also might like to learn about ethical principles which can be applied to the internet, as well as how often you interact with others in the digital world. Wiping out a pandemic requires, according to the rabbis, basic respect for life as the ultimate good, respect for human dignity, great doses of humility, compassion, and above all, care for the sanctity of life. We're told in Jewish tradition that ultimately we need to recognize that the ways of God are beyond all human logic. We can look to history to understand how humans have reacted in the past, but only time will tell us how we react to our current challenge. Keeping in mind these lessons, we might be able to help other people who are along the way. You know, it's also interesting to note that, I don't know how many of you have heard of the term Bikor Cholim? Bikor Cholim, anyone heard of the term Bikor Cholim? The words Bikor Cholim literally means to visit the sick. That's literally what the words mean. There's a Jewish society in Israel called the Bikor Cholim Society. People who make it their business to go and visit the sick. We're told in the Talmud, and I can only tell you what the Talmud says. I can't tell you the reasoning behind why it says it. But it says that if we go and visit the sick, it's such a mitzvah to go and visit the sick that when we do so, we remove 1/32 of their illness when you go and visit the sick. Now, how the rabbis came up with 1/32 is the part I don't know and the part I don't understand. What 32 parts has to do with illness, I think comes from mysticism. But if you think about it for a minute, the reason it may say that it takes away 1/32 of their illness is that if a person is left alone and is ill, they're thinking about being sick. They're thinking about being ill. If you go and visit them and you distract them from being ill, they're no longer thinking about their illness. You know, it doesn't mean that they're going to feel wonderful. It doesn't mean that they're going to feel all better. But by distracting them, you take away 1/32 of their illness, at least for the time that you are with them. So I'll be glad to take any questions that you might have. I just want to mention that there are in modernity there are considered 10 of the worst pandemics in history. One was the Black Death, 1346. One was the plague of Justinian in 541. The flu pandemic of 1918. The HIV/AIDS pandemic from 2005 to 2012. The Antonian, also known as the plague of Galen, 165 CE. The Asian flu in 1956. The third cholera pandemic in 1852. The Hong Kong flu pandemic in 1968. The Asiatic flu pandemic in 1889. And the sixth cholera pandemic in 1910. Those are considered the 10 worst pandemics to have affected people throughout history. Blaming Jews for pandemics begins at least as early as the 14th century, when Jews were held responsible for the Black Death, which caused anywhere from 75 to 200 million deaths, making it by far the largest pandemic in history. As the plagues spread across Europe, the people, of course, as I started my talk tonight, I said to you, people always look for an explanation. They always look for a reason. So the people's thoughts looked for a reason or a scapegoat for the devastation. And it didn't take very long for the populace, we think incited by church leaders, to blame the most convenient scapegoat of all, the Jewish people. And the allegation spread that Jews caused the disease by deliberately poisoning wells. Of course, conspiracy theories. A theory that gained support because the Jews were disproportionately unaffected by the disease. Now, the credit for the lower incidence of infection was attributable, probably in no small part, to Jewish law, pursuant to which Jews wash their hands before eating. Jews wash their hands after using the bathroom. They bathed weekly in honor of Shabbat. They would bathe monthly at the mikveh. They would ritually wash corpses before burial. And it's also worth mentioning, I think, that Jews annually cleaned out their grain supply for Passover, lowering their exposure to rats that carried the plague. Moreover, I think one other explanation was that Jews were regularly sequestered in ghettos, often opted not to use the common wells that were in towns and cities. And the Jewish conspiracy theory, though, gained additional credence when many Jews, while being tortured, actually confessed to poisoning the wells. The massacre of Jews spread swiftly through Europe, and as over 1,000 communities in Spain and France and eastward across Europe were exterminated, including major Jewish centers in Barcelona and Strasbourg, where 2,000 Jews were burnt alive in the Valentine's Day massacre on February 14, 1349, and Frankfurt on Main and Cologne and Mainz. Inspired Jewish cadavers were shoved into wine casks and floated down the Rhine River. In other communities, Jews were locked in synagogues and burnt to death. One of the few rays of hope, though, one of the few rays of light during the Black Death massacres was Pope Clement VI, who took noteworthy action to actually try to protect the Jews, including issuing 2 papal bulls in 1348, which stated that those blaming the Jews had been seduced by the devil, urged clergy to protect Jews, and personally offered papal protection to Jews in France. His efforts, though, were largely quashed by the Holy Roman Empire Charles IV, who extinguished all property rights of heirs to the estates of murdered Jews, thereby creating a strong financial incentive for local authorities to condone Jewish murders. And it was not only through the Black Plague, but there were other plagues and pandemics that the Jews were blamed for. Again, conspiracy theories like we have today, but conspiracy theories nonetheless. Okay, any questions?
I have a comment, Rabbi.
Okay.
So the fact that for millennia, Jews blamed themselves when there were catastrophic occurrences like plagues, that was the fodder, I believe, in my mind, for the non-Jews to then make the Jews the scapegoat. They knew enough to know that the Jews themselves said, we've disobeyed God, we've been wicked, we've done this, we've done that, and these are our just rewards. In a way, it seems to me like we gave them, I'll use the same word, fodder, for the casting of blame. Not that they probably would have found another way to castigate the Jews and to try to destroy them and blame them and make them scapegoats. But in listening to all this, that came to my mind, that we provided a storyline in a way.
I mean, I think you can, I don't think it's difficult to make that connection. The only thing I would point out and have you think about is the fact that none of these people who blame the Jews, followed the exact same line that said this was God's wrath upon not just the Jews, but on everybody. So I think you can certainly make the argument, which you've made. I just think you have to realize that you've got to stop short of saying that God had anything to do with the Black Death or the cholera epidemic or any of the other ones, because in no way was God blamed for any of these. It was just the Jews. People.
Yeah.
Just the Jewish people.
Yeah.
Thanks. Other comments, questions?
I don't understand how this helps us or directs us. It just makes us sound as crazy as other conspiracy people.
When you say, how does it help us? I think knowledge, I think it's just important to understand how biblical people, we read from the Torah. I think it's important to understand how people of the Bible saw disease. But remember, you're dealing with people who were, for the most part, uneducated. You were dealing with people who for the most part were in no way culturally astute. We were dealing with people who were pretty much uneducated, and the only rationale that they could come up with was that this was a sign that God was angry and that God was punishing us, and we needed to do something in some way to appease God's wrath.
So is that where the Hasidim still are? I mean, when I think about, most of us believe in science and vaccination and all those kind of things. Are these very Orthodox people still back where these stories were?
I think the people, I think those people, those Hasidic people or those ultra Orthodox people who look at the Bible as word for word, and the meaning is word for word, rather than critically understanding what it might mean for us today. I think when they study what's called Torah Lishma, I think it's something that they consider, that there is punishment for what we've done in the world. Sure.
Sounds like the Supreme Court.
Yes, there are people, to answer your question briefly, yes, there are people who are Orthodox who believe that this is a plague from God. They don't follow the science. No. And that's why there's such a shortage of or such a small number of people within the Hasidic community who've been vaccinated, because they don't accept the science.
Mhm.
Well, doesn't the book of Job show that it's not people doing things that make the difference? I mean, don't they use that at all?
Does who use that at all?
The Orthodox. I mean, if they're looking at the Bible,
Mhm.
you've got the book of Job, which in a sense, counteracts all the other stuff of saying that what people do causes plagues and so on,
Mhm.
and illness.
Yes, the book of Job stands opposed to that notion. But if you're asking me, do they look at the book of Job? No, they don't. They do not. And the reason, do you know the reason they don't look at the book of Job?
No.
As substantive, because Job was not a Jew. That's why they don't look at Job as substantive. That's sort of the bottom line as to why they do. I mean, you would think, yes, I mean, your logic is sound, that Job would explain it, but Job was not a Jew, so they don't often cite the book of Job.
Rabbi, I had a question for you. When you were explaining the black wedding concept, I was so intrigued by that. Maybe I missed what you were saying was the purpose behind the black wedding.
The purpose of the black wedding was that the community would take two unfortunate souls in the community, and they would give them a wedding. They would provide them with a dowry. They would support them. These were people who were ne'er-do-wells, people who might have been ill, people who might not have been able to afford a wedding. And the thought was that it would appease God with the deed of chesed, with their deed of right. This was a righteous act or a deeds of righteousness to do this. That was sort of the philosophy behind the Schwarze Chasana.
And that would then either lessen or eliminate the plague.
That would appease God,
Okay.
remove the plague from the people.
Like
It would show God that the people were worthy because they would do this righteous kind of this righteous kind of thing. But what I find to be, had any of you heard of the
No.
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 what I find fascinating about the Schwarze Chasana was not so much that the Schwarze Chasana took place in Europe, in the 1700s, but that it spread around the world, that it became such a powerful tool for the appeasement of God and getting rid of illness, that it spread worldwide. It's to Philadelphia, to Toronto, to the New World. It was not just something that was followed or practiced in Europe. It came here to the New World and was practiced here. I looked up. I mean, I had known about the Schwarze Chasanas, but I did some research, and the last Schwarze Chasana that I was able to find was in the 1900s. Okay, so it was not all that long ago. I mean, less than 100 years ago was the last Schwarze Chasana, public Schwarze Chasana. So people were still 100 years ago, not just biblically, still trying to appease God with this deed of righteousness or this righteous act, so that a plague or a disease or an epidemic would be stemmed.
Was it picked up by any other religious groups, this concept?
No, not that I've ever heard. At least when I say no, not that I know of. I only know of the Jewish community doing it, and I only know of the Hasidic Jewish community doing it. I've never heard of a Reform Schwarze Chasana or a conservative Schwarze Chasana or even a modern Orthodox Schwarze Chasana. The only groups I've heard doing this were mystics and Hasidim.
Interesting.
Yeah, for sure.
The
Other
things
questions?
people come up with,
What?
the things people come up with.
Sure, because again, my contention is that people need answers and they need reasons, and this gives them a reason. This gives them a way that they can even though the Schwarze Chasana has nothing to do with the epidemic. I mean, we know that scientifically. In their minds, they were doing what they were able to do, what they were able to conceive of, to be able to fight against, to be able to in some way fight against it. It's what they were able to conceive.
I think when terrible things happen, people want to feel that they could control something. If it's a ritual or something like what you described, because even if we understand the science behind it, we feel so helpless. We want to be able to do something to try to ameliorate the situation. I mean, I'm just thinking about when my kids had croup, and I would rub the Vicks on their chest, and I knew that it didn't do anything, but it was a ritual, and I felt like, just maybe, and at least I could do something. And it's just, when you're in that situation, you want to take some action.
You want every possibility.
Right.
You don't want to depend just on the physical. You also want to depend on the spiritual.
Yeah. too.
Spiritual is an added benefit to possibly helping.
Right.
And I think, but going back to what you were saying, which I think is interesting. Yes, we want to be in control, and when we're not in control, it drives us crazy.
Right.
And we look for ways that we can feel like we're in control of a situation or of the situation.
Right. Because it's so scary.
And
But
for the people in the Bible, that was a way of them gaining control. You know, when they're fasting and they're praying, that was a way of them being in control. It was what they could control.
Right.
I think Lee has a question.
Yeah, this idea of trying to find an explanation really goes back to Greek mythology, which was the same thing. They're trying to understand something, so they make up a construct that seems maybe not accurate, but reasonable, rational for the time.
Right. It's
Yeah.
right. It's rational. Exactly. I think it adds a degree of rationality to something that's irrational. Yes. Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely.
so I understand that when answers are not available. What's hard for me to understand is when answers are available and
You're-
still people go off doing irrational things.
You're
Like,
talking about now.
yeah,
Yeah. I mean, well, there are those people who do not accept science. I mean, there are people who don't. I mean, look at the people, for example, who were in Sarah. Well, I don't know if you heard about this in Naples, but in Sarasota, there was a chiropractor that was signing religious exemptions, not medical exemptions, but religious exemptions. You know, that now what the chiropractor had to do with the spiritual to be able to sign religious exemptions is beyond me. But when someone doesn't acknowledge, I won't even say accept, I think it's more acknowledge the science behind it, and is unwilling to understand what science is purporting about whatever the illness is, or what the steps that need to be taken should be, they look for something else. And those other things oftentimes come in crazy conspiracy theories, you know?
Yeah.
It's hard to understand. I mean, it's difficult to understand. I mean, you're Gusty, you're a nurse, I think, right?
yeah.
You're a woman of science. So I mean, it's your life is steeped in science. Not that there's not other aspects of your life, but you understand science when it's spelled out to you. There are those people who simply won't accept science. I mean, look at climate change. You know, look at that, and people that don't accept the idea of the science behind climate change. I mean, that has nothing to do with the pandemic, but they simply do not accept any scientific information, that they will not allow any scientific information to become part of their life. Now, why they're afraid of it, or why they rebel against it, or why they won't acknowledge it, that's something that I don't understand. I mean, it's one thing with scientific knowledge not to accept it as emes, as the truth. It's another thing not to acknowledge that it exists. That's a different thing. I mean, science science exists. It is a real entity in the world, and it has explanations for things. If you don't want to accept them, okay, I can understand how you may not want to accept them, but you can't just disassociate yourself from the fact that it exists. It exists.
And, if you go through history, go back to Copernicus and the Catholic Church, he was excommunicated, and when he said that the sun was, the center and the planets went around the sun. And the Catholic Church said that was heresy.
Right.
And they wouldn't accept the science. And that kind of mindset has just been perpetrated throughout history.
And it's so hard for us.
So
because-
I can understand if you don't want to accept the science, but how you can say the science doesn't exist.
Right,
Is beyond me.
right, right,
That's the part that I have the greatest difficulty with.
right.
Is it really an unwillingness?
The complete denial of the existence of something that exists. That
If somebody wants to talk, raise your hand so the rabbi knows to call on you.
Lee,
Is it an unwillingness or an inability?
I don't know. It's a really good, you're a psychologist. You tell me, is it an unwillingness or an ability? I don't know.
I really think it's an inability. I had a guy here said, well, if climate change was real, they would stop the rains or start the rains or change the temperatures. They could control all that. And he really believed that. And I wasn't going to argue with him because he was putting up a light fixture for him.
Yeah.
There are times when it's important to keep one's mouth shut.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly.
No,
Well, I understand that there's more than science. We all say Mishnah Berachs and all that. That's not scientific. That's the extra Vicks, right, Shelley?
Yeah, exactly.
And we believe that too, but that's additive. That's not instead of.
Right.
exactly. It's not instead of. Right. It's not instead of. It's the complete denial of looking. It's sort of like, I guess the way I envision it is how you put blinders on a horse when a horse runs a race and the horse can't look left and the horse can't look right. That's the kind of thing I see with people, that they wear blinders. They put blinders on and they don't want to see anything else. I think sometimes it's a choice not to see, because if they have to acknowledge that there's something else, then they have to think about it. And if they have to think about it, it may cause some confusion for them, and they may question what they've been taught to believe, or what they've been believing up to this point. And they don't want that hassle. They don't want to question.
Mhm.
We're taught in Judaism, we're taught to question. That's one of the things we're taught to do all the time, that we're supposed to question. We're supposed to ask questions. But there are those people who don't come from Jewish tradition who are given an idea, and that's the idea for life, and that's what is. And there's no looking to the left, there's no looking to the right, there's just looking straight ahead. And that's just the way it is.
But life is so much simpler for them.
Sure.
Yep.
There's no decisions to be made.
It is simple. Yes, it is simpler. It doesn't make it, just because it's simpler doesn't equal better.
Right.
Yeah.
No, for sure.
It doesn't make it better.
Yeah.
You know, we're taught to think and think things through. And the more information we're given, the more we're able to think things through, and the more qualifications we can put on things, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah.
I
a
think
good-
one of the discouraging things to me is that there are some people who are capable of understanding science, but have different goals, maybe making money or not having their business interfered with. And so they want to confuse people because they don't believe that everybody being healthy is one of their personal goals.
Yep. I
Yeah.
think, I think it's not only that. I think sometimes it's this philosophy, you know, that I'm right, and this is the way it is, and this is the way I'm going to live my life, and no
Don't
one's
confuse me.
going to change my right. Don't
Confuse me with facts.
confuse me with the fact. This is the way I'm going to live. This is that's just the way. That's just the way I'm going to live. I was reading an article about a restaurant owner in I think it was in Texas. I'm almost sure it was in Texas. And there was a couple who was eating in the restaurant, and they were wearing masks. And they were wearing masks because, excuse me? They were wearing masks because they had a immunocompromised child, and they didn't want to bring anything home to their child. It wasn't really for them, it was for the child. And the owner of the restaurant came over and made them leave the restaurant. You know, they made them because they were wearing masks. And his philosophy was no masks in my restaurant, no matter what. It doesn't matter. I mean, it's that kind of that stubbornness to think outside the box, or to think there may be other situations or other innuendos or other ideas that may come into play here. People don't want to be bothered. They just
I mean,
want-
I heard today on NPR that EMTs were refusing to get vaccinated.
Yep.
And nurses, some nurses,
Yeah.
and police,
policemen.
firemen.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, somehow somebody's talked you into acting against your own self-interest.
Mhm.
It's Darwinian.
It's what, I'm sorry, what'd you say?
I said it's Darwinian. People who refuse to get vaccinated or to act in their own interests are not fit, and they're, eventually they may get a Darwin Award and be removed from society, removed from the gene pool. It's
But they may
I think
remove some other
it's almost
people.
poetic justice. I think when you read about or hear about people who have refused to get vaccinated, no matter what, they don't care, and then they're on their deathbeds and they say, "Gee, I guess I should
Can
have
I
listened."
get the vaccine?
Yeah,
Or
and
they
that to me
ask
is
for the
Darwinian.
vaccine.
That's Darwinian. It's a matter of
Bob,
you can't fix stupid, and that's what you're dealing with.
Bob Hirsch, you have your hand up? I think you have to
He's on
unmute.
mute.
There we go. I've been here all along and my face hasn't been here. You can hear me now, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Back to the vaccine we were talking about. And there's a force out there, obviously, in addition to the science. There's obviously a force, I like to call it. We're talking about God, the universal force, and there's science. But you see all the news shows and you see people who on their deathbed, and they're always saying, I should have had the vaccine. That's where they realize that science exists. And that's who we're trying to get their brothers and sisters and their relatives in the backcountry to get vaccinated before they're in the hospital. That's what they realize when they're dying, they should have had the vaccine. They finally realize that the science works.
You know, the old adage, we grow old too soon and wise too late.
Right.
Yeah.
So
But
that's
there
what
are
I just wanted to
people-
mention.
nurses are
They
telling-
do understand the science, but it's too late.
But
Yeah.
nurses are telling stories where they're caring for dying patients who are still insisting they don't have COVID.
Hmm.
But they don't all get it.
How about the
Yeah.
physicians who are railing against the vaccines? And one of them is the Secretary of Health of the state of
Yes.
Florida.
Right.
Yeah.
The surgeon
Yes,
general,
and he has absolutely no background in infectious diseases or public health.
Right.
He doesn't belong in that position, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I wonder how difficult it was to find that guy.
Right.
Could have pulled anybody off the street.
Florida, it's amazing.
And he got $100,000 raise.
yeah, right, right,
Right.
right.
He was right on the contributor list. That's where they got him.
Hmm.
I mean, it's so strange to follow the threads of these conspiracy theories about COVID, but especially the conspiracy theories about the vaccines.
Yeah.
That yes, there are people who get the vaccine who do come down with COVID, but the vast majority of people have been vast majority of people have been protected.
We've all got chips in our arms tracking us now, right?
Right.
Yep.
I just read a paper that came out this week that from June through September, due to the inadequacy of the vaccinations in Florida and Texas, there were 90,000 excess deaths in those two states during those months. I don't know, it was 90,000 or, I'm sorry, I'm probably overstating it. It may have been 20,000, 90,000 excess hospitalizations because of the poor vaccination rates in those two states.
Mhm.
But it was outrageous.
Yeah.
So, Bob, why do you think Florida is doing so much better right now?
Doing better in terms of what?
Well,
In terms
lower,
of,
at
in terms
least
of
lower
infection rate,
cases.
Collier
Yeah.
County, the Collier
Yeah.
County infections.
Right, and Lee County too. It's gone
I
down
think-
pretty
I think
dramatically.
overall, things are just starting to decrease. That the sharp increase we had in August and September, everything is just going down overall. The surge that we had then it's just coming down overall, and that's what's happening.
Do you attribute that to a lot of people getting vaccinated?
More people are vaccinated, more people are infected, so there's less spread.
Okay,
Yeah.
That doesn't mean we're not
The
going to see
people who-
more. It doesn't mean we're not going to see more infections when people are crowded in. More people are coming from the north. More people are crowded in vacationing here. Actually, that's not, anything can happen in the winter. People are going back to the north and then coming back in January. I'm not sure what's
Right.
going to happen.
yeah.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
It
or
may be that
comments?
there are fewer people to infect because some of those
Right,
who got the infection have died or recovered
Right.
through
Exactly.
hospitalization or
right. They
so
have
the
that, they have
pool
natural
of people
immunity.
is
They have,
smaller. The
right,
pool
they have
is
natural
smaller
immunity.
to infect,
Right.
or it's burning
That's
itself
part
out.
of the herd immunity. Exactly.
That's right.
And we hope that if we get another variant, that they won't be susceptible to it. Or we all won't be susceptible to it.
Yeah.
The other thing that I always find intriguing is the individuals who reject the science, they create their own science, or they create what they think is their own science. Like we shouldn't do the vaccine, but we should take this ivermectin. That we should do, and that's going to protect us. So they're in their minds, they're still thinking scientifically, even though they're still using conspiracy theories to create some sort of rationale for a cure for this.
Right, or saying that I won't get vaccinated, but if I get sick, I'll take Regeneron
Right.
and be able to stay out of the hospital
Mhm.
rather than get the vaccine so you don't even run that risk.
Right.
Yeah.
And now there's a shortage of that product for livestock, by the way. The
Ivermectin, yeah.
it's shortage now.
I don't know. I've got plenty of it for my dog for the heartworm. I can sell it to them.
But I get.
What
guess
about the people who say that God will protect them?
Oh,
What about the people who say God will protect them and refuse to get
well, I'll
the
have
shot?
the rabbi can handle that.
Well, again, I think it goes back to the people, the same logic as the people from the Bible, from biblical personalities, where, they'll appease God in some way to be able to feel protected, that they're doing something righteous or they're doing something just. That's going to grab God's attention for them, and that will protect them.
But isn't that a core belief of Christian Science or Christian scientists, so-called scientists?
Well, Christian Science says that God will, not so much that God will protect you, but that whatever happens to you is God's will.
Well, that's fatalism.
Yeah.
And that's a very easy way to live.
Yep.
Or
You
die.
don't control your destiny. You don't
It's
control
not,
your own destiny.
it's not as if Christian scientists don't die. It's not as if Christian scientists don't come down with cancer or leukemia or heart attacks or anything like that. It's just that they believe that this is God's will. And if it's God's will to heal you, then God will heal you. If it's God's will to take you, then God will take you. But whatever happens, what you call fatalism, will take place according to God's will. That God is just and God is righteous and God does nothing wrong and God is in control of my life. Or I turn my life over to God. I mean, I think the spiritual aspect of religion is really important. It's really important. It's one aspect of life that I think many people don't take enough advantage of. But I also think that there's a thought process that you have and that you should utilize, that God gave you a brain and God gave you a mind to reason and to reason things through. That you're not just supposed to rely on God. You're not just supposed to rely on the power of God. That when if you go back to the Bible, I mean, if you want to look at the Bible, someone asked me before about literal, I think it was you, Gusty, about literal translation or literal understanding of the Bible. When God created man, God and man were partners. They were supposed to work as partners. It wasn't that God was supposed to do everything and man was supposed to do nothing. That wasn't the deal between God and humanity. That man and God were supposed to work in consort with one another. It wasn't just supposed to be a reliance on God as in Christian scientists.
Is that something a concept that we find in Genesis?
What
you just said
yes.
about
Oh yeah.
Okay, because I don't think I ever saw it that way.
Yeah, that man and God are partner. God and man are partners. That we don't function just at the behest of God. That we're supposed to use our own mind. For example, when this week, when in the Torah, when God tells Abraham to take his son Isaac to Mount Moriah to sacrifice him, you know, Abraham has the power to either say yes or no. He has the power to choose, not just to listen to what God says. He has the power to say no, which he does. He basically says no. I'm not going to sacrifice my son. When Abraham, in the study, look at the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, when God says, I'm going to kill all these people, and Abraham says, what do you mean you're going to kill all these people? What about the righteous people? You're going to kill all the righteous people as well? That you can if you think God is wrong, then you argue with God, and that's the difference between Abraham and Noah. That's one of the big differences between Abraham and Noah. Noah does everything that God tells him to do. Never questions, never asks, just follows along. Abraham, on the other hand, is constantly challenging God. Moses challenges God.
Right.
Does not just go along with what God wants.
Okay. So this is a concept that appears actually a little bit later in Genesis. It's not as though
It's not in the story of creation. No, it comes out. It's in the story of the ancestors.
All right. I was thinking about it from the very beginning, from the Garden of Eden.
It starts with Abraham.
Okay.
And from Abraham and from Abraham onward.
Okay.
Okay. Yes, Michael.
Yeah, realistically, are there any legitimate religious exemptions to getting the vaccine?
Religious? When you say religious, do you mean?
Yeah. In other words, New York, as an example, has said for teachers or other people that they will not recognize any religious exemption. They'll only recognize the rare medical exemption. And of course, these groups have taken them to court. And in some cases, I know it's New York. I know at least one jurisdiction, the people taking them to court lost, and the judge sided with the government.
I guess
there is no religion.
I guess the question that I ask you is, what do you mean by legitimate?
Well, we talked about Christian scientists, and maybe based on their core tenets,
right,
that could be a religious exemption,
right,
that they don't take any medication.
There are core beliefs that people have that can act as religious exemptions. Yes.
But
yes.
For Jews, as an example,
I don't. In my studying, in my reading, I have yet to come up with religious exemptions for Jews. I have not. That doesn't mean that other people won't disagree with me, but I have yet to come up with anything in the Torah or even in the Mishnah. I haven't looked in the Talmud, but even in the Mishnah, that gives us the declaration that we can claim a righteous religious exemption from this vaccine. I don't see it.
And
because
does that apply to
the reason, let me tell you why I say that. Because there's a concept in Judaism that's called pikuach nefesh. And pikuach nefesh literally means in matters of life and death, all Jewish law can be thrown out. Okay? That life triumphs over everything. And in because of pikuach nefesh, because life triumphs over everything, I don't see how anyone can make the case for a religious exemption for the vaccine. I don't see it.
Is it similar with other religions other than Christian Science?
Oh, there are other religions. Evangelical Christians have some of the core tenets of Christian Science.
They do. Okay. All right.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Well, that's
Irene?
very interesting, Rabbi. I mean, the outbreaks of measles virus in the Orthodox community in New York several years ago, when
Yeah.
so many children were infected, you would
Crazy.
think they would run to get measles
Right.
vaccine after
Exactly.
that.
Exactly. You would think, the whole notion of there being fetal material that's used in the vaccines, and they refuse to inject fetal material because they're against abortion, is as bogus a claim as I have read and heard and studied. I mean, that's one of the reasons why Orthodox Jews will not get, because of the conspiracy theory that the vaccine contains remnants of fetal material because during the R&D portion of the vaccine, there was a thought that there was fetal material that was used at one time. No one has come forward and said that that's actually the case.
Right, it didn't, right. Okay.
Right. So that's one of the reasons why people are refusing on the grounds of religion not to use the vaccine. Irene?
I don't know if I want to bring up this can of worms, but you said you used the phrase that life prevails over all.
Well, pikuach nefesh means
Right.
life.
Right.
Life.
So how do we respond then to a woman's choice choosing an abortion?
Because a fetus is not considered a nefesh in Judaism. A nefesh fetus is not a living soul.
At
It's
what
not a
point-
living soul. It's not
Until
a
they
living
can breathe
soul
on their own.
until
So
it
at what
exits
point
the
does it
womb.
become a living
I
soul?
can't
What-
hear you.
What point does it become a living soul?
When it exits the body, when it exits the mother's body, then it
Okay.
becomes a living soul. When it takes its first breath, the idea is it's breathing in the soul, its soul. Okay, a fetus. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether you're Orthodox or Hasidic, or no Hasidic rabbi will say to you that a fetus is a nefesh, is a living soul. It's not.
Okay.
It's not. That's how Jews utilize the idea of choice,
Okay.
because it's not. And also, the second line stance to that is that the mother, the host of the fetus, her life is a life. So in the case of who gets saved between a mother and a fetus, the mother always gets saved. Always, 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 always. The fetus does not.
Mhm.
The fetus is just a host in the body until it takes the first breath of life. When it brings in that soul, then it has a soul. That's why choice has always been furthered by Jews.
Mm.
So you could bring up the can of worms. It's okay.
Okay.
Okay. Yes, Patty? I think you're
Need to unmute yourself.
I was saying goodnight.
Oh, good night. Good night.
It may be time to say goodnight.
Thank you for coming.
Thank
All
you,
right,
Thank you for
Rabbi.
having.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah,
Thank you.
very good.
Very
I
nice.
enjoyed it.
Good night, everybody.
Let you know when the next adult ed is.
Thank you.